Hello there and welcome. My name is Hugh and you're tuned to the second episode of the Friendly Podcast, a brand new multimedia project from Ireland Yearly Meeting. I'm here to share a range of interviews with folks from both home and abroad to hear their views about being friends today. First up this time, we say hello to Felicity McCartney. Felicity is a member of South Belfast Meeting in the north and a former clerk of the Yearly Meeting. First off, she describes her earliest memories of being involved with the local meeting.
Well, as you know, I grew up as a friend, so we used to go to Sunday school. And if there was a business meeting, or particularly if my mother was involved in making tea or something like that, I would just be there. So, so did other children were there too. And we just hung around all the meeting events in a way that I think it would be hard for children to do these days. But we were were part of the scenery.
I've asked this question a couple of times, but do you think there's a big difference between those who were born into Quakerism compared to those who might find it later in life?
Yes, I think there probably is, because some of us haven't really been challenged the same way. People who come in have had to think it through much more clearly. And I think that's very good and stimulating in meetings. Yeah.
Am I right in saying that South Belfast is slightly younger than other meeting houses within the city?
So we've been going 50 years, and it was a monthly meeting agreed to set up two other meetings in Belfast because FWCC was getting very big. But the one in East Belfast never got set up in the end, but the one in South Belfast did. And it used a series of rented premises, starting in somebody's house and then using the Seventh-day Adventist church because they worship on a Saturday. And they let South Belfast use their church for meeting on a Sunday. And one of the reasons was that the pastor there had previously worked in Leicester, where the Quaker meeting was very helpful to the Seventh-day Adventists during the Second World War. So he felt they were a friendly bunch and should be helped. And then they eventually got their own premises off the Lisburn Road.
How was it growing up in and around Belfast at the height of the Troubles in the 1970s? Were friends quite active around that time?
I think when the Troubles came along and there was violence and disruption and rioting and so on the streets, friends really wanted to try and help the situation, partly because of our peace testimony and just we didn't like to see our neighbours fighting and attacking each other like that. So the first piece of action was really opening our two meeting houses for people to sleep in when they had to leave their homes, but either in one case because of fire and in another case because of intimidation. So in that way, the friends who were there then sort of got to know what some people's difficulties were, got to know about how people felt more secure in separate housing areas on either side of the community. And you had both Protestants and Catholics being intimidated out of areas where they were the minority, in some cases quite a small minority. And then as a result of that kind of relief work, friends were asked to get involved in providing help to prison visitors when the first round of internment without trial came along, when Republican prisoners were interned without trial, followed by loyalist paramilitaries a few years later. And it turned out that friends were acceptable both to the government who ran the prison service and also to the groups of Republicans and Loyalists who were to end up in there. So we were asked to do that, and that was the beginning really of Quaker service as it is now. It's quite a big organization, still doing prison work, but doing other things as well. So the initial invitation was to make tea, was to provide a facility for visitors where they could rest before they went into their visit and have some tea, have a children's play area and that sort of thing. But that grew into giving families advice and getting to know what the problems were. So that things often start with small beginnings and a few friends, you know.
And were Young Friends active at the time too?
Yeah, well, I think Young Friends have always been active in doing their own thing. I mean, when I was a young friend, we had Young Friends Committee for all of Ireland and organised a few things, and then people like Dublin Young Friends and Ulster Young Friends had their own activities, which again were completely organised by Young Friends, and there was quite a social element to them. And the result of that and things like JYM was that we all got to know each other in the age group, which was very good. And I've noticed that more recently, until we had the youth coordinator, I think Young Friends were a bit more divided up, you know, into sort of individual meetings. And there weren't perhaps so many opportunities to get together across the island, which is one of the main functions and delights of Ireland Yearly Meeting. We organised gatherings every year. I mean, of course, Dublin Young Friends always organised one in Glenmalure. We went to the Glenmalure Hotel every year, and usually in June, I think. And sometimes people from other areas joined us for that. And it was a kind of weekend. I think it was a weekend with only one overnight. Can't quite remember. But in addition to that, there were lots of one-day outings and things. And then in the north, a lot of Young Friends were involved in my Island Camp. And then there was JYM. But I mean, when I was going to JYM, one year there were 96 Young Friends there. But you see, in those days, young people and teenagers didn't have all the options they have today. You know, there weren't so many out of school activities and sports and arts and a whole lot of other things that people are involved in. So, you know, it was a social life for young people, and it was an opportunity to go away from home and meet with other young people.
And was the book Coming from the Silence, was that part of a response to what was going on? Did you feel like you just had to do something?
I knew that during the Troubles, Quakers had taken a number of quite significant initiatives, which led to organisations which did important work to do with peace and reconciliation and poverty and education. And there were an awful lot of concerned friends and volunteers involved in that work. And I felt, and so did a few other people, that it was very important to acknowledge the input of the volunteers and acknowledge the importance of the work that was done and also of the Quaker ways that were used to do that work, which includes, by the way, working cooperatively with other people and other organizations. That's part of it. So we decided to get a group together to talk more about how this could be done, and identified 4 major projects, and then a whole lot of other, if you like, lower key local things, which included the Young Friends Work Camps Initiative. That was one of those, and the Prayers for Peace in Portadown, and the work that Westbrook Meeting did with a council in Newry. So there were a number of sort of things that didn't have their own chapter, but that also illustrated the way Quakers work in difficult times. And then we got people together who would do the writing of each chapter, plus a couple of other support people who would help with fundraising because a project like this was going to need money to publish and distribute and so on. And we met over about nearly 2 years, I think, from start to finish, mapping out what we would do, identifying 4 people who would write the 4 main chapters about the projects, and then identifying another person who was Arthur Chapman, who wrote the chapter on the other bits and pieces, if you like. And then myself and Lisa Mare, also called Anne Mare, we'd worked together a couple of times in Belfast on a couple of different things. And she was by then an academic. So she and I agreed to be editors of it. And I also wrote the chapter on why Quakers do this, because this is something we'd be asked. We go around getting involved in Quaker House, which worked with politicians and leaders and whatnot, or we worked at grassroots in neighborhoods with people trying to help people to have activities which would educate people to be able to speak for their views and not have to go out and kill people to prove they had a particular view. Our community development approach, because community development is an alternative to violence for getting change initiated. So there were all these different levels of work, but people would ask us, why do Quakers do this sort of thing? So it was important to explain, we're not just do-gooders or an odd selection of people who happen to want to work on this one project, but we have, it all comes from our beliefs of that of God and everybody, and of equality, and of the sort of testimonies that we have to peace and stewardship of resources and all those things. So it all comes from our central beliefs, really, in really how God works in mysterious ways with people. But also reconciliation means not fighting with people. So, there's quite a lot of stuff about Quaker beliefs and views behind it, but quite often the people we worked with in the projects didn't really know that. They just knew somebody was trying to help them, but didn't know. So that was an important part of it. And then also to record all that had happened and the different approaches that were taken. And I think because you asked about Young Friends, the Young Friends work camps were quite instrumental in friends working in places like West Belfast, because we had been there as Young Friends, and work camps in London, which is part of BYM, they'd be sending a group of volunteers, and a few of us locally would be organising what happened on a summer play scheme or something. And that would sort of get us known in that community as people who were helpful. And Quaker work camps were run both in nationalist West Belfast and also in the Shankill in Protestant Northwest Belfast. So they knew that we were working on both sides, which was important. And then later on, when Quaker House came along and when Quaker Service started working with prisoners from those areas, there was already a positive feel about Quaker work. Like at the end of the Second World War, the friends who worked on the German-French border worked both at grassroots. So it's very good to have a good wide range of contacts and be alongside those who are suffering, as well as knowing people in power or people who can get action. When Quaker House started, there was hardly anybody doing this kind of work. There was hardly anybody doing active peace and reconciliation. I mean, the peace people started some years later, but they were working at a different level, really, although there were a number of Quakers involved in that. But there weren't very many people working with politicians and paramilitaries. In fact, a lot of people were against even talking to paramilitary groups. And so Quaker House was a pioneer, and this came out very much in a reaction from the like of David Stevens in the Irish Council of Churches at the time. He said it's very important for Quakers to do this work because they've got both the concern and the flexibility, whereas some of the bigger churches would never be able to get around because they could never agree who they could talk to or something like that. So that was quite important. But by the time Quaker House closed down, the Community Relations Council here had an information pack about reconciliation groups, and there were something like 70 groups listed. So everybody was doing it by then. And so, and that's appropriate for Quaker work, to hand over to other people. And the last few pieces of work they had been doing from Quaker House, they were doing them with 2 or 3 other organizations anyway, who might have gone on and done them. So there just seemed to not be a unique Quaker role anymore, but we were very satisfied that we'd started the project off and started the ball rolling. And by that stage, there was also a government installment. So the politicians were talking to each other up there all the time anyway, which was a good outcome.
How do you feel about the ongoing political stalemate in the north around Stormont? Do you think you've seen it all before, or are there aspects of the current debate that have surprised you?
I've seen some aspects of it before, but I think we're in a very, very different situation now, which not everybody has caught up with. The difficulty is that, as Duncan Morrow puts it very well, who's a lecturer in political science here and very thoughtful, I think, and he's helped us a lot. He says if you look at the history of the border, when Ireland was divided, the eventual Republic of Ireland was able to develop the way it wanted itself, but the North wasn't. So it had nothing to do but look back to history and look to better times and look to each side wanting something different and not really being able to resolve a way forward. And that's been going on for 100 years. So we can't expect people to just solve it overnight. And also, we have developed so differently from the rest of Ireland that even working in partnership much more than we have done before is now difficult because it's like being on another planet in a way, for some people, not for everybody. Yeah, so I think there's quite a lot of hurt on both sides, I think, because people haven't really resolved the fact they want different outcomes. And also, I think on both sides of the community here, we're looking to ideal solutions for them, which don't include the views of the other side. So I don't think we've got over that yet, although there are many, many more people who understand more about it. And I think a younger generation don't care so much, maybe. But we'll have to wait and see.
So it should be said too that you are a former clerk of the yearly meeting. Can I ask, what did you learn from holding that role?
I found one of the very interesting things was interaction with outside bodies, both other churches and faith groups, where, because we get invited to a whole lot of things and take part in Irish Council of Churches things and all that. And then also with government agencies in Dublin, hardly ever in Belfast. We don't get invited to much up here. But just all that interaction, because you're the public face of Quakers, really. And the clerk gets invited to a lot of stuff and either goes or asks somebody, some other friend, would you represent me if it's something in, I don't know, Tipperary or something, you might ask somebody local to do it. But one of the things I did, which I learned from Alan Pym, who was a previous clerk, I tried to visit all the meetings in Ireland and sort of talk to friends and get to know them and get to know how all the meetings worked. And that was very educational, because when you concentrate in your own meeting and you don't visit other meetings regularly, you don't remember that there's a whole lot of different ways of doing things, and you learn from other meetings ideas for your meeting. So I'm very much in favor of that kind of interaction. I think that's very good for everybody. The only reason we think a North-South divides is if we have to do something in jurisdictions, like, deal with child protection or something, because the legislation might be a bit different. But I think there's maybe a bit more of a difference between urban and rural meetings, for instance. And clearly, a lot of the rural meetings in the north would be theologically quite evangelical, but that is a spectrum. Everybody's different, you couldn't sort of box people. But then there are evangelical meetings in the south as well. People forget that sometimes. And probably my meeting, South Belfast, is probably the one that looks most to Britain Yearly Meeting. I mean, we use a lot of Woodbrook stuff, and we have quite a few people in our meeting who came from England, and there are people who would, we even have a member of Britain Yearly Meeting who doesn't want to change her membership. So I think people use we use all the children, young people's resources from BYM and Philadelphia and places, just because it's easy to do that these days with all the resource materials and stuff. I mean, I think it's very important to keep in mind that we corporately discern outcomes and decisions. And it's not a question of like a debate with two sides to it. If people have different opinions, they may express them, but it's then their job to sit quietly and wait till the meeting discerns, but not to sort of stand up and speak louder or whatever. And people do feel very strongly sometimes about views, but they sometimes have to just listen to what all their friends think as well, and see if an outcome can be discerned that fits with the views of most people, or that most people can live with, or whatever way you want to look at it. So it can be a bit of a long process sometimes. And sometimes clerks have to say, let us just quietly consider this and not have any more views expressed till we have had time to think it through, or even consider it at the next meeting or something. So it can be slow, and there's some people who don't like that because they may be impatient for action or decisions or whatever. But I think it's a very good method, but people need to understand it, and they also need to believe in the process. They need to believe there is a process of spiritual discernment there, because otherwise it doesn't really make sense.
Do you think the pandemic has shown much about the relevance of Quakers going forward? Do you think there's something unique about us as a group of Irish friends?
Absolutely. We reach both quite liberal European friends and also quite evangelical friends in, for example, Africa and South America, because we have things we can share with both. And I think that has been very significant, because most yearly meetings, I mean, in America, people just divided into subgroups of like-minded people. Europe and places like Australia and New Zealand, where friends are quite liberal and even a wee bit way out for some, there's not as much diversity as we have in terms of Quaker thinking. And I think that's very good and very stimulating for us as a yearly meeting. And it's been one of the great values that I think we have, and I value it very much, that we have a good wide range of people. I mean, it's been very important that we're able to meet online, and most meetings have done that, which is new for most of us. But and I mean, it enables people to visit very easily. People have visited other meetings. We've had people from other countries joining us, including in discussion groups sometimes, not just to meeting. And I think some of that will continue. It also, I think one of the things it's going to do is help participation of outlying people in yearly meeting and All Ireland activities, because people can join on Zoom where they wouldn't be able to travel from outlying areas. So that's going to be important for, it's not just all going to be Belfast and Dublin, but outlying people can have more input, and I hope that continues.
So Eustace Street is one of 4 meeting houses in Dublin, and until 1986 it was used as the headquarters for Quakers in Ireland. Nowadays you'll find them in Stocking Lane in Rathfarnham next to Bloomfield Nursing Home. Anne-Marie Woods is part of the Quaker community in the city centre after initially finding friends in her early teens.
My first introduction was in my childhood when my next door neighbour worked for Alfred Bewley. Alfred had a farm of Jersey cows in North County Dublin, and my neighbour Peter worked there, and he spoke very highly of Alfred, and I just was aware of the word Quakers. And then our trips into town would involve, they weren't very frequent, but would involve going to Bewley's in either Westmoreland Street or Grafton Street. And what struck me about Bewley's was that it was a great place to go. You would see people from Dublin and also people from the country up for their shopping trip. And you would meet or see what we would have called celebrities nowadays. But also there was space for people who weren't that well off, the lonely, the homeless. And they were never told to leave the cafe. They were given a cup of tea or coffee. And it had an impact on me. I didn't or wasn't able to articulate it as a child, but I knew it was something that was right and proper, that people were treated well. And then I suppose I went to my first Quaker meeting when I was in my early 20s. I went to Eustace Street, and the meeting was downstairs. It wasn't upstairs. And I think it was in the older building in the library. And after the meeting, this man who I now know as David Poole spoke to me, and he asked me, would I like to come in stay for a cup of tea? And I said, oh, something or other. And I ran out of the place, absolutely, totally intimidated by it. But yet I remember the ministry. The ministry was about why we have a God. It was a loving God, how he allows us to suffer. And it stayed with me. And it took me a further 20 years before I returned again. And that was because my first secretary worked for Victor Bewley, and she spoke very highly of Victor. And I thought, there's something in these Quakers. I'm going to go again. And I went, and it was before Christmas, and I met Colm O'Boyle at the door. And Colm was so welcoming, and he brought me upstairs to the meeting room. And I thought, after the hour, and I think it was silent, I said, I can do this at home. So the following Sunday, I sat down in my comfy armchair in silence, and I stayed for the hour, and I thought, no, there's something more to this. I'm going back. So I went back for Lent. I said, I need to give this, 6 solid weeks in a row to see what this is about. And as the saying goes, Lent continues with me. I'm still there.
Can you describe the meeting for me? Just at that time when you were still in your early days of attending, what sort of relationship do you think Eustace Street had with the wider community in the city centre? Were you conscious of that at all?
Yes, it was very different, we'd say, to a parish church. In a parish church, there is a community, because which is determined by location, and the people who would attend that church would have similar interests or would know maybe each other from outside. Whereas Eustace Street would have a very diverse makeup, because its members and attenders were made up from people all over the city, and indeed the suburbs as well. And plus there were visitors, and there are lots and lots of visitors that come who are Quakers from other countries, who would come and join us for worship on a Sunday. So I certainly in the early days wasn't conscious of the work that was going on behind the scenes. And yet, it was only in time that I learned about people being involved in the Anna Liffey Drug Project, with prison work, with work serving on boards in disadvantaged communities and so forth. So that came much later in time, as I got to know Quakers themselves.
Do you think it's very different for somebody who finds Quakerism later in life compared to those who know no different and are born into it?
Oh, it has to be. I mean, I suppose all of us who have come from different faith traditions bring that culture and that heritage with us, the good bits and the bad bits. And I think if you're born into it, you are aware, but not so aware, because of course, the Quaker community is so small, and especially those who are born into it, they would certainly have friends who would have come from other faiths, but it would be different. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And in those intervening years when you weren't attending, were you a seeker? Were you looking for something?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say every church known to Dubliners. I went to them all. Absolutely went to them all. And came away. And I mean, for some it was just one visit, but I knew they weren't speaking to me. What spoke to me about Quakers was the fact that no one was telling me what to think, what to say, what to do. That direct relationship with God spoke to me. And that's, I suppose, what attracted me to stay after my 6 weeks in attendance. It was that revelation continues. Your awareness of God, your deepening of your faith continues constantly with your knowledge of God.
I'm just interested to know if you have any thoughts about the wider community of Quakers in the city and how that's evolved over the years. Are you conscious of a very strong bond between the likes of Eustace Street and Churchtown, Rathfarnham and Monkstown.
When I was considering membership, Doreen Dowd said to me, the late Doreen said to me, Anne-Marie, go and visit all the other meetings. I announced to her that I'd been to Monkstown, and she said, oh yes, which was very different because they have sort of a semi-programmed meeting for worship. And I obviously went to Churchtown and Eton-Derry. I also went to Eton-Derry. I remember going to Eton-Derry and Rathfarnham. And of course, they're all part of Dublin Monthly Meeting along with Drogheda. And yes, we would be, because as time went on, I used to go to monthly meeting as well. And you would get to know friends from the other meetings. And then often there would be the monthly meetings rotated, so that twice in the year Eustace Street would host monthly meeting and friends would come to meeting beforehand. So you get to know people that way. Yeah.
You touched on it there. In terms of monthly meeting and being involved with committees, is there anything that you appreciate about the business method that we do have in the yearly meeting?
The business method, well, first of all, it's open to everyone to attend, even if you've just arrived to your first meeting. I like the way it starts with a period of worship, and that kind of centers everyone down, and it just allows people to collect their thoughts and focus on what is upcoming. Then when a matter is discussed, I like the fact that it's just, you were asked just really to speak once and allow time between people speaking to reflect on what they've said. So I think it makes me in particular a much better listener. It allows me to be open to other points of view, which maybe I would have occurred to me. I would, and many people would have said it. There's an item on the agenda and you say, okay, yeah, I know what that's about. I know what way I'll think about that. And you go to meeting and someone speaks from a totally different standpoint that maybe you hadn't considered before. Lo and behold, your mind is changed or persuaded in one way or the other, So that kind of, I like that part of it. And then the fact that there's no vote taken, because votes can be very divisive. And if some issue is not resolved, and definitely there is opinions on both sides, then the matter is left to rest, and people then have to go away and think about it, maybe do further research, or maybe allow the other side to their point of view, so that some matters go on for years. But it does that's one of the disadvantages, and that decisions can be made very much more slowly than if it was something that was put to a vote, we'll say. But I do like it, and definitely if that sort of aspect would have in a way influences how I run my school and how we debate issues and so forth.
In terms of Quakerism itself, are you conscious of how it impacts your day-to-day life away from a meeting for worship environment?
Oh yes, very much so. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I'm a far more tolerant person. I'm more tolerant of people's differences. I'm certainly, and I hope one of the testimonies is simplicity, and I certainly would question everything that I buy, whether I need it or not, whether it really is necessary. And then when I do buy, am I buying from a company that practices, in as far as I know, good governance and treats their employees fairly with a good wage, insofar as I can know, but that's often very difficult to find out. But it definitely in sort of my daily life, would. Quakerism has certainly impacted on me. Yeah.
Are you conscious of the yearly meeting going through changes over the years that you've been involved with? Are there any sort of striking changes that sort of stick out to you that are poignant or significant in the involvement of yearly meeting and Irish Friends at large?
I suppose the two that strike me, the involvement of sustainability, and how Quakers were talking about sustainability long before many people had heard the word, and about the impact of climate change, and how they asked people to survey all their meetings and to look, first of all, at their own front door and how, their meeting was being run, and if any methods or areas could be improved upon. So that's one, and that's ongoing, obviously. And, you can't change the world overnight. It has to be a series of small steps. So that's one area. The other area, I suppose it's three areas. The other area would be the peace in Northern Ireland and Quakers' involvement in Quaker service and helping families from both sides of the community to come together and to work with them in helping them dialogue with each other. That's a fantastic body. And I suppose that was very much confined to Ulster quarterly meeting. And I'm delighted to say that, we are more aware in the 26 counties of their work involved, because peace affects the whole island of Ireland, and that is a very, very interesting area that I've seen a great change in more awareness of people, both north and south of each other. And then, of course, marriage equality, the decision to allow same-sex marriage, which was, I suppose, a momentous moment, but actually it passed pretty unnoticed by the rest of the world, But that was something that spoke to my understanding of the testimony of equality.
It's interesting that you touch on that in terms of the world not necessarily noticing it. Do you think, I guess in some ways that's sort of linked to outreach, maybe? I'm just curious, do you think much about the relevance of Quakers today in Ireland in the 21st century? Do you think the pandemic has done anything to show the relevance or the importance of Quakers? Have we learned anything from that process?
I think we're almost a secret society. And I know Quakers are, and absolutely rightly, don't blow their own trumpet. But I think there are lots of people seeking us and kind of almost stumble upon us. And I feel we probably could do a little bit more on publicity, PR, shall I call it PR? And that's one area that maybe we need to maybe make people aware of us as distinct from. And I suppose Quakers on one hand have a fear of proselytizing, but if people don't know about us, they can't find us, So yeah, and society has changed. Like long ago, if you wanted your information, you read a newspaper, and so there were notices with religious services on the back of the Irish Times on a Saturday, so people knew about meeting. But nowadays, you get your information from the social media, from the radio, and I think there's probably a need for us to make ourselves more visible in that sense, in through that media.
And what would we be saying, do you think? Is it a case of letting people know who we are and what we do, or is it a case of letting people know about the issues that we care most about? In terms of thinking about outreach and the future of the society, what do you think we should be prioritizing?
I think that's in terms of I suppose making people aware of us. I think it's important that we have an awareness that people are welcome, that people don't know where to find us sometimes. How do you do that? I suppose you do that with a website, of course, is your own website, and monitoring the traffic on that website. That would be one area. I think maybe lobbying is another area. I know Munster friends are better at lobbying than our Leinster friends. That increases the awareness, the way we can, put our point of view across. And I think that's important, of the various concerns that we have. Or even just, I think people being able, and sometimes people aren't able to say, hello, I'm a Quaker. And that can be difficult. Things like cultural, and we know from Dublin when we host Culture Night, the hundreds that come through our doors. I mean, they're coming through our doors for a reason. They're looking for something. I mean, even if it's just historically just to find out about us. I mean, we can't dine out on the famine. And so, so we need to move on and become more relevant. Yeah.
Forgive me if I'm wrong, but I understand, like myself, you've had the opportunity to travel and see other yearly meetings. How have you found that experience of seeing other yearly meetings and how they do their business? And do you think there's anything that makes us unique?
I've been to Britain yearly meeting, and that was a very interesting experience because it was a huge number of people, first of all, and there was like two events going on. There was the business side of it, and then there was the fringe. I call them the fringe events, in a sense it was an exhibition of those who are involved with other concerns, and how we compared. I had a lovely conversation with a lovely lady about her work with refugees in England, and it was just interesting to see how the British government, basically puts refugees into a centre until they are processed, with some money, all right, but that families are segregated. So that was kind of interesting. Here, families can live in any of the centres, but also they are free to live elsewhere if, of course, they have the means to afford rent, which of course is a big issue. But there is the long delays, and that's common to both of us. But it seemed that while Quakers, and I can only speak of Quakers' involvement in Mosney, is very welcome and is very welcome in England, they seem to be nearly kind of regarded as do-gooders who are a nuisance, to the running of centres. So that was just an impression I got. The other thing that struck me about Britain Yearly Meeting, and something maybe Irish friends need to be careful about as we become more diverse, is that Britain Yearly Meeting struck me as being a very white and middle class for a society that has been very diverse for so long. And I don't know if that's because, I don't know why, because, they have a fantastic website, they are very well publicized. I would think they get quite a lot of attention in the press, but it was just something to be that I myself spoke to me and said, we must be aware to make sure that people of all colours and backgrounds are welcome in our meetings. And that was something that struck me. So that was Britain Yearly Meeting. And as I said, I was hoping to go to Bolivia, but haven't quite got there yet, and hope to do so after coronavirus has been resigned to history. Yeah.
And just before we finish, I must ask, in terms of committee membership, what do you get out of that? What do you love about being part of a Quaker committee?
Well, if I speak about nominations committee, because I was involved with Yearly Meeting Nominations Committee for 7 years, I thought it was a fantastic way of getting to know how the society is run. And that's one of the other things that attracts me about Quakers, is that everyone has a part to play in running the society according to their time and talents. And I loved nominations because you got to know people, you got to know every meeting, you got to know every member in the country, you got to know all the committees that make up the society and how it's run, from the practical kind of running meeting houses to finance to IQFA to ecumenical bodies. And it was a great way to get to know the whole country. Yeah, so I think I got more out of it than they did of me, but I certainly enjoyed it. And I suppose that's a very just like what we're doing now. It's part of our Quaker service, and that can take any form at all. So it's there's a place for everyone in our society.
Finally, for now, we put a spotlight on Stop Fueling War, an organisation that was born in 2017 and is now based in France. It builds on 20 years of Quaker witness outside the Eurosatory arms fair and is supported by a network of French and European anti-militarist groups. Ollie Spencer, a young adult friend from Britain Yearly Meeting, works for the organisation and was never far from Quakers growing up.
Both my parents are Quakers. And I attended Quaker Meeting from a young age. I've attended quite a few different Quaker meetings. So I attended Lewis Quaker Meeting, but then also Toulouse Quaker Meeting and Quercy as well. And I'm actually a member now of France Yearly Meeting as a Quaker. So yeah, I've attended quite a lot of different meetings and of varying sizes and attendance. So more young people, I suppose, in the Toulouse Quaker Meeting that I attended when I grew up, as well as the Lewis one, and that was great. But the Quercy one was very small, and mostly, I mean, sometimes we were lucky if we were five people there. So that was kind of the experience that I had, and I think like a lot of people in Quakerism, I sort of drifted away from it for a while in my teens, early 20s maybe. I didn't attend Quaker Meeting for a while. And then I suppose as a result of my Quaker upbringing, I had very strong feelings and ethics values that I thought I need to put these into action. And so I studied international relations and development, had quite an eye-opening time at the University of Sussex. A lot of my sort of well-wishing, good thinking was challenged, and I had a bit of a political awakening and that sort of thing. But it was a very interesting time. And then I ended up gravitating back towards Quakers, mostly through working on peace and disarmament and protest against arms fairs. That was my way back in, because as you're probably aware, Quakers have been very active on the arms trade for years and years. So yeah, that was kind of my way back in. And now I work for an organization that was founded by Quakers in France called Stop Fueling War, which works on the arms trade in France and sort of rethinking the current security paradigms and why everything's like super hyper militarized, and that's the work that I do at the moment. And I'm also co-clerk for the Quaker United Nations Committee in Geneva.
So before we get to that,
I went away for a while, but I'm back in force.
Oh, that's good to know. Before we get to those interesting things you mentioned there, just tell me about France and what you love about it, and how you feel Quakers in France differ from those in Britain. And I'm just curious because I've never had any experience of Quakers in France. Again, just what do you love about the country and its culture?
Well, I love France. It's a wonderful place. It's an amazing place to grow up as well, especially in the south of France where I was. Just, the weather, the food, everything. It's delicious. But Quakers in France is quite a different situation, I think, to Quakers in the UK, in Ireland, in that there's just not very many of us, really not very many. And I definitely think some of my friends when I was growing up thought I was in some sort of cult, but it was quite a different experience in France. Very small meetings, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes just 5 people, a lot of older people, a lot of expats as well. So a lot of the people who are Quakers in France are British Quakers or Quakers from the US. So that there are a few, there are still some French Quakers, some homegrown Quakers, but it's definitely a different experience.
So were you mostly in Paris or were you down in Toulouse, did you say?
Yes, yeah, mostly down south. Although I did work in Paris for a while and was working at the Quaker Centre there, the International Quaker Centre.
And how was that?
That was great. It's an amazing building. It's now been sold, and they're looking for a new placement because it was quite out of the way. But it was great to be there. They hosted the organisation that I work with currently, which is Stop Fueling War, or Cessez d'alimenter la guerre in French. And they were very kind to host us there. It was an interesting place. Sometimes I met people who were just interested in learning about Quakerism and who came by the centre, sort of just to find out a bit more information. I met also a peace pilgrim who was walking through Europe. I think he went through many different Quaker meetings and met many Quakers. But yeah, it was an interesting place to be, and they've got quite a good sized meeting up in Paris compared to other places.
So the arms trade isn't the lightest of subjects.
You could say that again.
Do you think it was by accident, or was it intentional that you feel like you fell into that sphere? Did that kind of happen very unexpectedly or spontaneously? How did you kind of arrive at this sort of junction where you felt this was an area that you wanted to become vocal on?
That's a good question. I don't know if I can pinpoint an exact time. I think, well, my mum was quite heavily involved with French Quakers on the arms trade, and she's also one of the founding members of the organisation that I currently work for. So she obviously had a very big impact on me in that way. But it was also whilst I was at university, and I met some people from Campaign Against Arms Trade, which is the UK based anti-arms trade organisation. Run a couple of workshops with them, and I had a tutor who I also think heavily influenced me at Sussex, who worked on sort of the political aspect of the arms trade. And what really drew me to work on the subject of the arms trade is that it's a very strange entity. It's like an industry and a trade that's treated in some ways very similar to other industries and trades, but beholden to different rules, and is the exception to many rules. Like, for example, the arms trade. In the arms industry, you can use offset payments when trading with, like, fighter planes. You can. So country A is buying fighter jets. From country B. Country B says, okay, we want to sell you these. And so country says, okay, you need to sweeten the deal a little bit. So country B then says, okay, if we sell you these and you buy these fighter jets, we will build a company in this area of your country, or we will do some sort of technology transfer where we teach your companies how to produce the same weapons. And obviously there's a lot of corruption when it comes to the arms industry, and there's also human rights to take into account, which, you know, is not the same for every kind of industry. But yeah, and the other thing that all surprised me about the arms trade was the sort of very close relationship between governments and the arms industry, and how the patterns seem to be the same in pretty much every country. So you'll have your sort of nation state government, and then there'll be a military and industrial complex where the government supports the export of weapons, but in many different ways, both through, like, subsidies and also sending attachés or people abroad to help sell the weapons. So basically weapons has a very strange space and holds a strange space in the international community, and it seems to impact so much that people don't realize
How did France compare with other countries? Were they are they one of the worst ones out there in terms of their involvement with all of this?
Yes, it's definitely one of the worst in many ways, unfortunately. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love France. France is an amazing place to live and to grow up, but their arms trade and arms industry record is, well, depending who you ask, but in my opinion, it's very poor. France is the third largest arms exporter in the world and has been for several years running. And that's behind the US and Russia. So that gives you some kind of indication of how well they're doing in that sense of exporting their weapons. But, you know, they export to human rights abusing regimes, you know, they to Saudi Arabia, who, you know, in one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, who's causing one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world in Yemen. They sell to Egypt, and they sell to many countries where the weapons get used against civilian population, but also very little parliamentary oversight or control in a way. There's no parliamentary commission or thing like that keeps a track of arms trade. The French members of parliament only get one report a year on arms exports, and that's very much like aggregated figures. So basically very little information shared, no democratic control or transparency, and, well, our clients themselves, really.
And can I ask, did you find, first of all, how old is Stop Feeling Warm? How old is the organization?
Oh, it was only set up in 2017, so it's a very young organization. So
up to that point, was there anything similar that was going on, or did you strongly feel that there was a missed opportunity up to that point with the work that you do?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are other organizations who work on the arms trade. There's a research institute who does a lot of amazing research on the French arms industry, but we did find there was very much an us-sized gap to fill on sort of raising awareness about the arms industry in France and the arms trade, because basically you talk to anyone on the streets in France and no one has any idea that France is the third largest arms exporter in the world. That's just not something that people are aware of, and people aren't necessarily aware of who France is selling to and why it's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, there are big organizations who campaign on human rights, like Amnesty International and you know, big household names like that, and they're very much focused on the human rights aspect, and they do an amazing job at raising awareness. However, we also wanted to look at sort of the whole system within which arms trade works, and the reliance on military, the fact that, you know, France is militarily engaged in the Sahel, as well as the arms trade and also democratic control. It's quite a large mandate, but we basically felt that there wasn't enough awareness on the subject, and people in France knew a bit better what was going on and how money was being spent, their tax money was being spent, it would be worthwhile talking about.
This might sound like a very basic question, but so forgive me if it is. How long of a problem has this been for France? Is this a very historical thing that they're the biggest exporters of arms? Do you know how much of a problem this has been?
That's a very interesting question that I'm not sure I know the answer to.
As much as anywhere else, there's been corrupt politicians in France, and I'm just curious, is that part of the problem?
Well, yeah.
Clearly it is, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, France, an interesting country to look at, because there is strong relationship between the military and education. It is also, an arms producing country, so there are a lot of jobs in that rely on the arms industry, and there's definitely some areas of France where that is where arms companies are the main employer. I suppose since the end of the Second World War, right, there's just been a trend throughout the world, during the Cold War, up until like the 80s, 90s, countries were all trying to produce their weapons and be able to arm themselves. So the reason that most countries export their weapons, if they are arms producing companies, is so that they can pay for the production of their own weapons. And the concept that France and many other arms producing countries work on is that they need to be able to produce weapons for their own army. They need to be able to equip their own army and not be reliant on any other country for imports of weaponry. So that's what the sort of basic theoretical concept from which they're working. And so governments like in the US, in the UK, really invested in the arms industry, and they subsidies, to help the research and development. They, subsidize exports. For example, as well, recently sold some fighter jets Rafale to Egypt, and the Egypt of the loan. It's just like a weird system in which they economic and financial sense, but it's actually all about trying to protect their own sort of nation state and protect their interests, really.
Do you feel, or do you find in the work that you do that it's a young person's game, all this activism? Are you conscious that you're part of a minority in doing this kind of work in terms of your age and where that sits? That's
a great question. I think, as with many sort of activist spheres that have often been led by Quakers, there are a lot of people who are involved in the activism and who are sort of pioneers in the field. What I find, I suppose, frustrating is that there are so many young people at the moment who are, invested in working on climate change and who, or many different social causes. And it disappoints me that they're not necessarily looking at the arms industry or like the sort of military industrial complex as part and parcel of these causes. Because, say, for example, let's take climate change and protection of the environment. They are always the exception to the rule, and they want to get this right. But I think the Pentagon and the sort of US arms industry police as much as Sweden as an entire country. And also the reason why, things don't get invested in health or education or the environment, governments are always going to prioritize their military capabilities. So these things are all linked, and I think it would be worthwhile if a lot of people saw the interconnections between the arms industry, the military industrial complex, and climate change, or lack of investment in healthcare, education, mental health, you name it, as a part of this.
Do you think it would be very different if you hadn't had an upbringing in Quakers? Do you think you would have found this type of work, or do you think you're, for want of a better way of putting it, do you think your calling in life might have been very different had you not had that strong upbringing in Quakers?
That is a question that I ask myself on a weekly, if not daily. I genuinely don't know, and I would like to think that I would have found my way somewhere in this direction, but I can't honestly say that I would have. I think my upbringing had a huge impact on me going into this work, and especially the peace testimony and the pacifism that comes with being a Quaker. I mean, that has shaped my university degree choices and my work choices and my values and ethics throughout life. So in all honesty, I don't think so.
But on that, do you feel, now that you're involved with it, do you think Quakers at large could be more vocal or active on social justice, climate, arms trade issues? Do you think it's almost imperative that we are, or do you think we're already pulling our own weight?
We do pretty well. I being co-clerk of the Quaker United Nations Committee of Geneva, I see the really amazing work that Quakers are doing at the UN level to talk about issues such as, there are 4 programs in Geneva. One is the human impacts of climate change. One is sustainable and just economic systems. One is human rights and refugees, and the last one is peace and disarmament. And I mean, that's a huge mandate for Quakers, but they do amazing work on getting rights-based language into the UN and sort of working on a diplomacy sort of in using quiet diplomacy. And I'm really in awe every time I speak with them on what they managed to achieve. But I do think that there is space for more activism on this, and maybe more sort of standing up for what we believe in a way that's maybe a bit more radical. I think the current systems that we live in, capitalism and patriarchy and all of these systems of oppression, are very linked to the state monopoly of violence, and that, sorry if that's getting a bit sort of wordy and jargony, but all of the social issues I think that Quakers care about are connected.
Do you think anybody can be an activist?
I think it's actually quite difficult to be an activist. Maybe this is my own experience, but it is. I think a lot of the people around me are as passionate as I am about this subject, and sometimes it's difficult to explain why I care so deeply about this and why they should as well. It's not for the faint of heart. It's depressing and it is exhausting. And when you tend to work for a cause that you really believe in, you probably, you don't just clock off at 5 p.m. That's it for the rest of the day, and you don't need to think about it. These things linger with you, and you're always thinking about ways you can do better and do more, do differently. So it's not easy, but I think if everyone put in a bit, then it would make the biggest difference in the world. You don't all have to be sort of, I suppose, career activists like myself. It's just about standing up for what we believe in and talking to the people in power, speaking truth to power.
It sounds though like it's an awful lot of responsibility to do it right all the time. Yeah,
there's always more you could be doing, and there's never enough money or people to do it.
Do you think there's some kind of unwritten rule out there where it's okay to be a Quaker even though you might necessarily be involved on a regular basis with your local meeting?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that, and I also think a lot of people are Quakers and they don't actually realise it yet. But they, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that I think a lot more people would join Quakerism if it was more focused on publishing or on publicizing the Quaker ethics and sort of a distilled version of Quakers that doesn't use so much Quaker jargon and the language that can be quite impenetrable unless you're in the know or you grew up a Quaker. So yeah, I think a lot of people are Quakers who are waiting to find out what Quakers mean.
Do you find that it's very different for people who are born into Quakers to those who may find it later in life?
I have no idea. I mean, my experience is obviously very much one of someone born into Quakers, so it might be difficult for me to comment for someone who found Quakerism later in life. I think you have an advantage when you're born into Quakerism in the sense that you sort of understand the language. There's definitely a language that you need to learn, and that I'm still not 100% sure I have down, but that is a little exclusionary if you don't know it. And I think, we could really do better at that.
Linking back to the work that you do with your activism work, is it always hard, or is it hard to stay positive all the time? How do you balance that?
It can be challenging, but I think Quakerism is one of the reasons why I do stay positive, because I do believe in the sort of shared humanity of everyone and the inherent good, I suppose, of people. Or, what you could call the light in everyone, or that of God in everyone, depending on how you like to phrase it. And so that is one big reason why I keep going and be positive, is because I do see that. And the other reason, I suppose, is, there is room for change, and change only happens when people see the problems and sort of get fed up of the current situation. And I think that is what's happening. People are sort of currently fed up with, wealth distribution, inequalities, the way the world currently works. And the pandemic has shone a light on many things that are unequal and unjust. And that is, I have hope that, that is going to be more obvious to people now, and that we have a space to change. So yeah, I'd say I stay pretty positive overall.
In terms of the future of Quakers and the yearly meeting, have you ever considered what you might like to see change?
Yeah, I do think there are several things that we could do. I mentioned previously the fact that the language that we use is quite exclusionary in this, unless what I don't know, someone who's not a part of Quakers would never know what a meeting for sufferings is, or there's just like a lot of jargon terminology that we use that is not very transparent. And then I think there's a sort of fundamental essence to Quakers and Quakerism, which are the ethics and values by which we live, and those are almost universal, and like they could be universal. And if that was distilled and shared, and it doesn't necessarily mean we want to convert everyone to Quakerism and everyone should be a Quaker. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is there is a universalism in a way to a lot of the values by which we live, and that put like human beings at the center of everything. So I think there's something similar with Quakerism that can be distilled and shared. But I don't know. I mean, the thing is, I don't think it's also unique to Quakerism. It's part of a lot of major religions.
And that concludes another episode of the Friendly Podcast. If you like what you've heard, don't forget you can subscribe to our social channels. And if you'd like to find out more about Quakers in Ireland, please log on to our website, quakers.ie.